Welcome to a tale woven from the threads of memory and mist, a chronicle not of triumph, but of quiet sorrows that linger in the rain-slicked cobblestones of a city long since lost to its own dreams. In the hush of this evening, as the gentle rhythm of the rain falls like a distant lullaby, we turn our thoughts to a place where the line between man and nightmare grew thin, and the sky itself bled with a terrible, pale light. We speak of Yharnam, a city built upon a profound and ancient yearning, and of the celestial bodies that watched its descent from the cold, black expanse above. Let us set aside the clamor of the hunt and step softly into the shadow of the blood moon, allowing this story of ambition and ruin to carry you into a peaceful and deep repose. There is a place, first, that exists now only in echoes and scholarly fragments, a place of stone and ivy and quiet, desperate thought. Biogenwith. The name itself feels old, a relic spoken in hushed tones, a ruin before it was ever built. Picture it, if you will, not as a grand university, but as a collection of buildings nestled by a vast, placid lake whose waters were as dark and as deep as the secrets they would soon seek to plumb. It was a place of learning, yes, but of a peculiar and hungry kind, led by a man whose body had grown frail, but whose eyes held a fire that could pierce the veil of the mundane world. Provost Willem. You can almost see him there, on the balcony overlooking that silent water, his fingers tracing the patterns on an armrest worn smooth by time and worry, his gaze fixed not on the reflection of the moon on the lake's surface, but on the abyssal darkness that lay beneath it. His was a mind that understood the universe was not merely what could be seen and touched, but a vast, layered text written in the language of stars and dreams, and he was determined to learn its grammar. The key was found not in a library, but in the earth, in a wound-torn open beneath the city of Yharnam, the Pithumerian labyrinth. This was no mere cave or catacomb. It was a sprawling, subterranean architecture, a tomb city built by a race of people so ancient they felt less like ancestors and more like concepts given stone and bone. The air within was thick with the dust of millennia, a fine gray powder that tasted of metal and forgotten prayers. The walls were not simply carved, but inscribed with geometries that hurt the eyes to look upon for two long patterns that suggested dimensions beyond the common three. And in the deepest, most silent chambers of that impossible maze, the scholars of Biogenwith found their prize. They called it the holy medium. To the touch, it was a viscous, mercury-like substance, cool and strangely alive, pooled in the chalices and vessels that surrounded a slumbering, calcified form. This was the old blood. It did not gleam or shimmer with a holy light. It was dark, almost black, and it seemed to drink the torchlight around it, holding the shadows within its own deep substance. It was a relic of the Great Ones, those formless, cosmic intelligences that drift between the stars, and it was the physical proof of a power that transcended human understanding. Willem, in his profound and cautious wisdom, understood the nature of this discovery immediately. He saw the blood not as a gift, but as a key to a door that was never meant to be opened. His philosophy, which would become the lonely, echoing motto of his life, was a simple, desperate warning. Fear the old blood. To him, evolution, true ascension of the mind, was to be achieved through eyes opened wide with insight, through the rigorous and patient study of the cosmos. The blood was a shortcut, a corrupting agent that offered power to the flesh, but at a cost the soul could not possibly calculate. He urged his students to seek the wisdom of the great ones, to line their minds with eyes, to become beings of pure thought and perception. But the blood offered a different path. It promised healing, vitality, a tangible connection to the divine. And that promise, whispered in the silent, potent language of its very existence, proved too sweet a melody for some to resist. The most brilliant of his pupils, a man named Lawrence, heard a different music in the silence of the labyrinth. Where Willem counseled patience and intellectual purity, Lawrence saw a tool, a means to an end that was both grand and immediate. He saw the suffering of humanity, the sickness, the frailty, the short, brutal span of a life, and he believed the old blood was the answer, a divine compassion left behind for them to find. The schism was not a loud, dramatic rupture, but a quiet, sorrowful parting of ways. It was the sound of a door closing softly in a long hall, the final turn of a page in a shared book. Lawrence and his followers left the quiet, contemplative shores of Biogenwith, taking with them vials of that dark, potent substance, and a conviction that would build a city and, in time, seal its doom. Willem was left alone with his lake and his warnings, a prophet whose voice was already being swallowed by the coming tide. And so, from the old, stoic dream of Biogenwith, a new and fervent faith was born, the Healing Church. Its name was a beacon of hope, a simple, powerful declaration that resonated in a world rife with pain. Lawrence, no longer a scholar but a founding father, a messianic figure, established its heart in the growing city of Yharnam. The city itself began to transform, its architecture twisting to accommodate this new religion. Grand cathedrals of pale, almost luminous stone pierced the sky, their spires like needles aimed at the heavens, their vast, echoing interiors designed to inspire both awe and submission. The air, once clear, began to carry the faint, coppery scent of blood, not as a sign of violence, but of sacrament. The central tenet was blood ministration, a holy rite where the old blood was transfused into the sick and the dying. And it worked. It was a genuine miracle. The lame walked, the blind saw, consumptive coughs were silenced by a surge of vibrant, impossible health. Yharnam became a pilgrimage site, a lured of a more visceral and tangible God, its streets filling with hopeful, desperate souls from all corners of the world, all seeking the church's blessed healing. Within the church's marble halls, its structure grew more complex, branching into specialized orders, each pursuing their own interpretation of the divine truth they served. The choir ascended to the highest spires, literally and figuratively closest to the heavens. They were the intellectuals, the successors to Biogenwith's legacy in their own minds, though they pursued their goals with a religious fervor Willem would have abhorred. Adorned in their celestial blue garb, they sought direct communion with the Great Ones, their research a blend of arcane science and desperate prayer. They communed with Ebrietas, daughter of the cosmos, a left-behind Great One found weeping in the depths of the Cathedral, a tragic, living font of the very blood they worshipped. Then there was the school of Mensis, a more shadowy, esoteric sect. They were obsessed with contact, with tearing down the walls between worlds through ritual and sacrifice. Where the choir sought to listen, Mensis sought to scream into the void until something screamed back. They delved into the nature of the nightmare, studying the terrors that lurked in the sleep of men, believing these were fractured reflections of a higher reality. The theological doctrines that grew around the Great Ones were a beautiful, terrifying tapestry of hope and horror. They were called gods, but they were not gods of mercy or moral judgment. They were forces of nature, cosmic principles given a semblance of consciousness. The Church taught that they were benevolent, that their blood was a gift, and that their silence was a test of faith. Hymns were written, liturgies were composed, all praising the celestial wisdom that had chosen Yharnam as its focal point. The initial effects of the blood ministration seemed to prove them right. For a time, it was a golden age, a period of miraculous prosperity built on a foundation of divine favor. But the blood was not merely a medicine. It was an essence, a piece of a being so far beyond humanity that to ingest it was to invite that otherness into the very core of one's being. It rewrote the recipient on a fundamental level, planting a seed that would, in time, bear a monstrous fruit. The very thing that granted such vibrant life was itself a slow, insidious curse, a patient poison that the city drank willingly, joyfully, in a toast to its own salvation. To truly understand the fall, one must first look up into the vast, indifferent canvas of the night sky and comprehend the nature of the beings that Yharnam sought to emulate and appease. The Great Ones are not monsters in the common sense. They are expressions of cosmic laws, their forms and motivations as alien to human thought as the thoughts of a human would be to a stone. They exist in a layered reality, a place where thought and dream and flesh are interchangeable currencies. The moon presence is perhaps the most pivotal, a pale, skeletal entity that seems woven from the fabric of the moon itself. It is a creature of cycles and compulsion, the architect of the hunter's dream and the director of the endless hunt. It does not hate humanity. It uses it, as a gardener might use a tool to prune a garden, its actions guided by a logic that is utterly inscrutable. It yearns for something, a silence, an end to a cry it hears echoing through the dimensions, and it crafts hunters as its instruments to achieve that end. Then there is Edon, the formless one. He has no body, no physical manifestation that can be seen or touched. Edon exists in voice, in sound, in the very medium of blood itself. He is the most ubiquitous of the Great Ones, his essence permeating the very air of Yharnam, his will enacted through his unknowing worshippers. He seeks a child, a surrogate, for like all of his kind, the great ones are tragically, universally bereft. They are parents who have lost their offspring, and their entire vast existence is bent towards finding a replacement, a process that invariably involves and destroys the lesser races they encounter. Ebrietta's, found in the altar of despair, is a poignant example of this loneliness. She is left behind, akin to the cosmos, weeping in her cathedral, a symbol of the profound sorrow that underpins this seemingly grand and terrifying cosmic order. This brings us to the nature of the realms they inhabit. The waking world is what we would call reality, but it is a fragile, thin layer of existence. Beneath it, or perhaps parallel to it, lies the dream. This is not a mere fantasy. It is a real place, a pocket dimension sustained by a great one's power, a refuge and a workshop for those bound to its purpose. And then there is the nightmare. If the dream is a refuge, the nightmare is a prison, a realm born of collective trauma, guilt, and sin. It is a psychic scar made manifest, a landscape of perpetual terror where the sins of the past are replayed for an eternity. The key to perceiving these layers, to feeling the eyes of the cosmos upon you, is insight. It is a terrible, double-edged form of knowledge. With little insight, the world appears normal if grim. But as one gains more, as the mind is lined with eyes, the veil is torn away. The true, monstrous forms of the world reveal themselves. The whispers of the great ones become audible, and the fragile sanity of the beholder is stretched to its breaking point. It is the price of seeing the world as it truly is, a chaotic, beautiful, and horrifying panorama of intersecting realities, all governed by parents who are forever mourning their lost children. And it was this very yearning, this cosmic grief, that would directly catalyze the physical and spiritual decay of Yharnam. For the initial miracles of the blood could not last forever. The first signs of the corruption were subtle, a sickness that the city's doctors initially misdiagnosed. They called it ashen blood. It was a strange malady, a wasting disease that left its victims pale, listless, and cold, as if the very vitality was being leached from them. The healing church, in its hubris, responded the only way it knew how, with more blood ministration. They believed a purer, stronger dose of the holy medium would burn out the sickness. It was like trying to douse a fire with oil. The ashen blood was not a separate illness. It was the precursor, the body's initial rejection of the alien essence within, a toxic shock before a much more violent transformation. The blood, seeking to express its true nature, began to rewrite the human form, to revert it to a more primal, brutal state. The beastly scourge had begun. It started in the old quarter, in the narrow, winding streets where the poor and the desperate lived crowded together. A strange aggression would take hold of a man, a feverish heat, a bestial rage. Then would come the physical changes, the thickening of the skin, the lengthening of the jaw, the spine curving and hardening, the hands twisting into claws. The scourge did not create a single type of beast. It was a chaotic, unpredictable metamorphosis, reflecting the inner turmoil and repressed savagery of the victim. The civilized man might become a shambling, hairy horror. The proud aristocrat might become a sleek, venomous predator. The city, which had been built on the promise of healing, was now being consumed by a plague of its own making. The streets that once echoed with hymns now echoed with guttural growls and screams of terror. The response was the hunt. Initially, it was a practical, if grim, necessity. The church formed the first hunters, men and women of resolve and strength, tasked with culling the burgeoning beast population under the cover of night. They were led by Jaeman, the first hunter, a pragmatic and sorrowful figure who crafted the tools and techniques of the trade in a lonely workshop. But as the scourge worsened, the hunt evolved. It became an institution, a fanatical purge. The hunter factions splintered. The church hunters, with their white garb and sanctified weapons, saw their work as a holy crusade. The powder kegs, with their love for explosions and improvised weaponry, were the heretics, the innovators who asked, "What if?" instead of following doctrine. And the hunters of hunters, like the lonely Eileen the Crow, emerged to police their own, to put down those hunters who, drunk on blood and violence, had become beasts in all but form. The hunts grew more frequent, then constant, until one night simply bled into the next, an endless, bloody twilight. The city gates were locked. No one was allowed in or out. Yharnam became a sealed tomb, its inhabitants both the prisoners and the monsters. The psychological degradation was absolute. Fear was the only currency. Neighbors turned on one another, whispers of infection leading to mob violence. The church, in a desperate attempt to maintain control, propagated the idea that the beasts were not their fault, that they were a separate, external evil to be purged. They encouraged a culture of paranoia and hatred, a collective madness that was in many ways more destructive than the beastly transformations themselves. The citizens barricaded themselves in their homes, peering through boarded-up windows at the chaotic streets, the constant chiming of the church bell a signal not of hope, but of impending slaughter. The healing church's attempts to contain the catastrophe were a study in tragic futility. They were trying to put out a fire they themselves had lit, using the very substance that was the fuel. They delved deeper into the forbidden knowledge of the labyrinth. They experimented on orphans in the hypogene jail. They created the monstrous church doctors, all in a frantic, doomed effort to understand and control a power that was, by its very nature, uncontrollable. The city of healing had become a charnel house, its grand cathedrals now mausoleums, its faith a death sentence, and its people, both man and beast, were trapped together in the closing jaws of a nightmare they had lovingly, faithfully constructed. The rain, which had begun as a gentle accompaniment to this remembrance, seems to thicken now, its soft percussion on the windowpane taking on the rhythm of a slow, mournful heartbeat. It is the sound of Yharnam weeping, a city drowning not in water, but in the consequences of its own sacred choices. Within those locked gates and beneath that perpetually twilight sky, the very substance of reality was beginning to curdle. The beastly scourge was not merely a physical disease. It was a metaphysical rot, a crack in the foundation of the world through which the nightmares began to seep. One must try to imagine the texture of that endless night. It was not a simple absence of sun, but a positive presence, a heavy, purple-gray gloom that pressed down upon the Gothic spires and cramped, winding lanes. The air was a foul broth, a mixture of the ever-present coppery tang of old blood, the pungent smoke from braziers burning pungent herbs meant to ward off miasma, and the deeper, more feral stench of fierce sweat and open grave. The citizens who still clung to their humanity did so in the most fragile of sanctuaries, behind doors barricaded with heavy furniture, in attics where the only light came from a single guttering candle, its flame a tiny, defiant assertion of a world that was rapidly dissolving. They spoke in whispers, if they spoke at all, their conversations a litany of terrors. Had that scratching at the door been the wind or something with claws? Was the low, guttural breathing from the alley below just a drunkard or the precursor to a transformation? Every shadow was pregnant with menace, every sound a potential death knell. And through these streets, the hunters moved. They were no longer just pest control, they were a force of nature, a storm of blades and gunfire. To see a hunter at work was to witness a terrifying ballet of violence, a performance both beautiful and abhorrent. Their movements were a blur of precision and controlled fury, the heavy, satisfying thunk of a transformed trick weapon burying itself in bestial flesh, the sharp, concussive bark of a blunderbuss followed by the wet, tearing sound of a staggered creature. They were silhouettes against the burning braziers, their long coats swirling in the bloody mist, their faces often hidden by masks or hats, making them less like saviors and more like faceless instruments of a cruel and necessary will. But the hunt took its toll on the hunters, too. The constant exposure to the blood, the relentless violence, the sheer, grinding horror of their task, it seeped into their souls. They carried vials of the very substance that caused the scourge, drinking it to heal their wounds and fuel their strength. A devil's bargain that ensured their survival even as it poisoned their spirits. You could see it in their eyes when you could see them at all, a hollowed-out look, a flicker of something not entirely human, a gleam of bestial recognition when they faced their prey. The line between hunter and hunted was the thinnest of veneers, polished smooth by blood and soon to be shattered. It was in this atmosphere of escalating dread that the Mensis ritual was enacted. The school of Mensis, in their shadowy desperation, sought to force a communion, to beckon a great one with a siren's call of concentrated human suffering and intellect. Their methods were the stuff of ancient, forbidden texts, a blasphemous calculus of pain. They gathered a host of souls, the Yahagal unseen village, and performed a ceremony of unimaginable scope. The specifics are lost, known only in the horrified whispers that echo in the nightmare, but the result was cataclysmic. They did not merely call out to the cosmos, they tore a hole in the fabric of the waking world. The ritual reached its spectral fingers into the realm of the Great Ones, and in doing so, created a sympathetic resonance, a feedback loop of cosmic energy that fundamentally altered the nature of Yharnam's reality. The first and most profound sign of their success, or their catastrophic failure, was the descent of the pale blood moon. The familiar, silver orb of the night sky began to change. Its light grew sickly, leaching of its cool silver and taking on a pale, pinkish hue, the color of diluted blood, of a wound seen through milk glass. It swelled in the sky, appearing closer, heavier, its pockmarked surface now looking less like craters and more like paws on some vast, celestial skin. This was the moon presence, its form now imprinted upon the very satellite it seemed to command, its influence made manifest. The light that fell from this pale blood moon was not mere illumination. It was an active, transformative agent. It cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe with a life of their own. It made the blood on the cobblestones glow with a faint, internal luminescence. And for those with even a modicum of insight, it revealed the unseen. Under the direct gaze of the pale blood moon, the world peeled back its skin. The amygdalae, those multi-limbed, weeping stone creatures, became visible, clinging to the facades of cathedrals and bridges like grotesque, parasitic gargoyles. They had been there all along, watching, waiting, their presence a constant, unperceived pressure on the collective psyche of the city. Now, they were revealed in all their terrifying glory, a physical testament to the fact that Yharnam had never been alone, that it had always been a specimen in a cosmic menagerie. The very air grew thick with a psychic static, the whispered thoughts and maddened prayers of the Great Ones becoming audible as a constant, low hum at the edge of hearing, a sound that frayed the nerves and invited insanity. The Mensis ritual had not brought salvation. It had pulled back the final curtain, revealing the stage upon which Yharnam had always been a player in a tragedy written in the language of stars and sorrow. The effect on the beastly scourge was immediate and horrifying. The pale light acted as a catalyst, accelerating the transformations that the blood had initiated. The changes became more extreme, more chaotic. Beasts grew larger, their forms more distorted, sprouting extra limbs, their bones breaking and reknitting into impossible, predatory shapes. The scourge beasts, once merely feral, now seemed to be possessed of a strange, alien intelligence, a cunning that was far more terrifying than mere animal rage. They began to gather in packs, to set ambushes, their howls taking on a chilling, almost ceremonial tone, as if they were worshipping the terrible moon that had birthed them. The hunt was no longer a culling. It was a war against a rapidly evolving enemy, an enemy that was, in truth, merely the reflection of humanity's own ingested divinity. And what of the citizens, the ordinary people trapped in this escalating nightmare? Their fate was the most poignant. Those who lacked the insight to see the full horror were perhaps the luckier ones, living in a world of mere beasts and madness. But for those whose minds had been opened, either by circumstance or by a desperate search for answers, the world became a phantasmagoria of terror. They saw the amygdala, they heard the whispers, they felt the weight of the moon presence's gaze upon them, a sensation like icy fingers tracing patterns on their soul. Many succumbed entirely, their minds breaking under the strain, becoming the wailing, incoherent madmen who shuffled through the streets, their babbling a fractured mosaic of cosmic truth and pure delusion. Others, in a final, desperate act of defiance, would simply sit in their chairs, staring out at the bloody moon until the life faded from their eyes, their bodies becoming just more furniture in the abandoned houses of a dead city. The healing church, the architects of this paradise of horror, were now utterly powerless. Their grand cathedrals became fortresses, but they were fortresses under siege from within. The choir in their high towers likely looked down upon the chaos with a mixture of terror and a perverse, rapturous awe. Their prayers had been answered not with grace, but with a truth so vast and terrible it was devouring the world. The school of Mensis had achieved their contact, but at the cost of their own annihilation, their consciousnesses trapped in a nightmare of their own making, their physical bodies left as desiccated, mummified corpses in a lecture hall that had become a tomb. The church hunters fought on, but their faith was a hollow shell, a ritual performed out of muscle memory rather than conviction. They were no longer healing, they were merely pruning a garden that was already dead at the roots. And through this collapsing world, a new presence began to walk. A foreigner, an outsider with no memory, drawn to Yharnam by the promise of a cure for an unrelated ailment, only to be caught in the city's terminal convulsions. This hunter signed into a contract with a mysterious surrogate of the moon presence would find themselves awakening not in the blood-soaked streets of the waking world, but in the hunter's dream, a pocket of tranquility perched on the edge of oblivion. Here the air was clear, scented with fresh grave flowers and old, damp stone. A lone, gnarled doll stood motionless, a testament to a creator's loneliness, and in a small, dusty workshop, an old man in a wheelchair, his face etched with the weariness of countless nights, would offer his guidance in a voice like grinding stones. This dream was a refuge, a place to mend weapons and spirit, but it was also a gilded cage, a nexus point from which the hunter would be sent out, again and again into the dying city, to participate in the hunt that was no longer just about beasts, but about the very nature of the cosmos and the tragic, desperate beings that sought to command it. The dream was a beautiful, peaceful lie, and its existence was the final, most profound proof that the waking world of Yharnam was already lost, its fate now in the hands of a dreamer who carried a trick weapon and the weight of a collapsing reality. The transition from the quiet solemnity of the dream to the visceral chaos of Yharnam was always a jarring descent, a plunge from a world of still, symbolic forms into one of screaming, fluid reality. The first sensation was always the smell, a complex, layered assault that no single word could capture. It was the iron-rich scent of blood, old and new, soaking into the cobblestones and splattered across the brickwork in great, dark swathes. Beneath that was the cloying sweetness of rot, the foulness of offal and things left to putrefy in the damp alleyways. And weaving through it all was the sharp, acrid smoke from the hunters' lanterns and the citizens' braziers, a burning mixture of gravewort, pungent incense, and gunpowder, a desperate attempt to purify air that was beyond cleansing. This was the perfume of the hunt, and it clung to the back of the throat, a taste that became as familiar as one's own breath. The sounds were a symphony of dread. From a distance, the city was a cacophony of bestial roars, their sources impossible to pinpoint, echoing off the tall, close-set buildings to create a surround sound of terror. Closer, there were the wet, tearing noises of conflict, the screech of metal on stone, the frantic, panicked prayers of those hiding behind their barricades, and the low, guttural moans of the afflicted who were not yet fully lost, their humanity still flickering behind eyes clouded with pain and rage. And underpinning it all, a constant, almost subliminal drone, the psychic resonance of the pale blood moon, a pressure in the ears that was not quite a sound but a feeling, the auditory equivalent of a migraine aura, a warning of the fragile state of the world. The hunter's journey through these streets was a navigation of a landscape that was both familiar and utterly alien. The architecture of central Yharnam was a maze of oppression, a testament to a people who had built upwards because they had no room to build outwards. The lanes were narrow canyons, the upper stories of the timber-framed houses leaning so far over the streets that they nearly kissed, blocking out what little light the bloody moon offered, and creating a perpetual, claustrophobic twilight. Washing lines hung like forgotten banners, their rags and tattered clothes stirring in a wind that felt like a dying breath. Every corner promised ambush, every shadowed doorway hid a potential tragedy. One could round a bend and find a small, makeshift shrine, a few candles guttering before a crude drawing of the healing church's symbol, only to find a few feet away the mangled remains of its creator, their faith having offered no protection against the very real claws that found them. The beasts themselves were not mere monsters. They were walking elegies, each one a unique and terrible poem of loss. There were the common, shambling types, the Yharnamites whose transformations had been slow and agonizing, their bodies swollen and distorted, their clothes torn to shreds by their expanding forms. They moved with a clumsy, heart-breaking desperation, their attacks more like the flailing of drowning souls than the calculated strikes of predators. Then there were the more evolved horrors, the ones who had fully embraced the scourge. The werewolves, or scourge beasts, that prowled the larger courtyards and bridges were creatures of pure, refined ferocity. Their muscles coiled under matted fur with a terrifying elasticity. Their howls were not just sounds of rage, but of a profound, existential anguish. The cry of a mind that remembered being human and was forever tormented by the memory. To face one was to confront the raw, unfiltered consequence of the old blood, a consequence that had fangs and knew how to use them. And yet, the most chilling encounters were often not with the beasts, but with the remnants of the people. The voices that drifted from behind the locked doors and boarded-up windows were fractured, their words a window into the collective psychosis. Some pleaded for help, their voices thin and reedy with starvation and fear. Others hurled curses and accusations, their paranoia having convinced them that every outsider was the source of the plague. Some simply muttered to themselves, reciting fragments of church doctrine or childhood nursery rhymes, the two having become horrifically intertwined in their shattered minds. The red moon hangs low and beasts rule the streets. Are we left no other choice than to burn it all to cinders? The question, asked by a weary, unseen voice, was not rhetorical. It was the central, unanswerable question of Yharnam's end times. To progress, the hunter had to become a student of this dying world, learning its brutal geography and its more brutal inhabitants. The brick trolls, massive, shambling figures who dragged their great fists along the ground, were once simple laborers, their immense strength now turned to mindless destruction. The crows, grown to the size of dogs and feasting on the plentiful carrion, were not naturally so large. They had been altered by pecking at the tainted flesh of the beasts, their beaks and talons becoming grotesquely enlarged, their eyes gleaming with a malicious intelligence. Even the rodents, bloated and aggressive, were testament to the fact that the scourge did not discriminate, that the old blood's influence seeped into the very soil and water, rewriting the city's ecosystem into a nightmare. The first major threshold for any hunter was the Great Bridge, a wide, stone expanse that arched over a precipice, leading towards the Cathedral ward. It was a place of symbolic significance, a gateway that had become a gauntlet. Guarding it was a creature of singular terror, a testament to the scourge's power to create not just beasts, but something closer to a demigod. The cleric beast was a being that defied simple categorization. It was immense, a skeletal, emaciated form wreathed in wisps of hair and burning with a feverish inner light. Its limbs were grotesquely elongated, its head crowned with twisted, antler-like horns, and its most defining feature was one arm that was horrifically swollen and mutated, a pulsing, necrotic mass of raw power. Its scream was not a roar, but a shriek of pure, unendurable agony, a sound that seemed to tear at the fabric of the air itself. This was no common citizen transformed. This was a high-ranking member of the healing church, a cleric, whose deep communion with the blood had resulted in a transformation of a corresponding magnitude. To fight, it was to understand that the church's hierarchy was mirrored in the scourge. The more holy blood one had consumed, the more profound and terrible one's fall from grace would be. Victory on that bridge was not a triumph, but a grim necessity. The death of the cleric beast was a spectacle of dissolution, its body erupting into a shower of shimmering, incandescent particles, a release of the immense cosmic energy it had contained. It was a brief, beautiful, and deeply saddening end, but the path forward into the Cathedral ward promised no respite. If central Yharnam was the body of the plague, The cathedral ward was its corrupted heart. Here, the architecture was grander, the stone whiter, the spires taller, reaching like beseeching fingers towards the oppressive moon. The air was, if possible, even thicker with the scent of incense and blood, the two smells having merged into a single, nauseating perfume. The streets were wider, but they felt no less claustrophobic, for they were patrolled by more organized, more dangerous foes. The church giants, hulking, blindfolded figures with massive stone pillars for weapons, paced their designated routes with a slow, mournful inevitability. They were the last, dutiful guardians of a faith that had devoured its own meaning, their immense strength a futile bulwark against an enemy that was already within the walls. And everywhere, there were the signs of the church's desperate, final efforts. In the Hypogene jail, a secret prison buried deep beneath the city, the echoes of past atrocities lingered in the cold, still air. This was a place where the church had conducted its most unethical experiments, hoping to distill the power of the blood, or perhaps to create a new, controllable breed of being. The results of these efforts were the dark beasts, skeletal creatures crackling with arcane electricity, and the snatchers, hulking, bag-carrying brutes who served as the church's clandestine gatherers of test subjects. To be taken by a snatcher was to awaken in this stone hell, surrounded by the wails of other prisoners and the ominous chanting of the unseen village residents above, a dirge for the dying and the damned. The hunter's purpose was slowly, inexorably, being shaped by these encounters. It was no longer just about survival or even about the hunt. Each beast slain, each secret uncovered, each fragment of law deciphered from a discarded note or a madman's rant was a piece of a vast and terrible puzzle. The hunter was becoming an archivist of the apocalypse, a witness to the final act of a tragedy whose first scene had been written in the quiet, scholarly halls of Biogenwith. The initial goal of seeking pale blood to cure a personal malady was becoming subsumed by a larger, more daunting quest. To understand the nature of the nightmare, to discover the source of the moon's pale light, and to learn what, if anything, could be done to silence the desperate, weeping song of the cosmos that was driving an entire city, and perhaps an entire world, into a final, bloody silence. The dream provided respite, but no answers. The doll would offer a gentle, soulless smile, her movements a serene and perfect pantomime of life. Jayaman would mutter cryptic advice in his sleep, his dreams clearly troubled by memories of a past hunt, of a companion named Lawrence, and of a secret he could never bring himself to fully utter. The workshop was a haven, but it was a cage, its peace a lie that only highlighted the truth of the horror outside. Every return to the dream was a reminder that the hunter was bound to this cycle, a pawn in a game whose rules were written in a language of blood and stars, a game that was rapidly approaching its final, irreversible move. The silence of the dream after the cacophony of the ward was a physical weight, a blanket of pure, unnerving stillness that settled deep into the bones. Here, the very concept of decay seemed suspended. The gray, cobbled ground of the workshop terrace was eternally damp, not from rain, but from some deeper, more metaphysical dew, each droplet holding the pale reflection of the stunted, flowering headstones that dotted the landscape. The air was cool and carried the faint, sweet scent of grave blossoms and old, polished wood, a smell that was clean yet carried the ghost of funerals. It was a place outside of time, a still frame in a reel of endless, violent motion. And at its heart, the doll waited. She was a masterpiece of longing, her porcelain skin flawless, her painted eyes holding a depth that was both empty and infinitely compassionate. She was a prayer given form, a testament to Jayaman's loneliness, and her existence was a quiet, constant question about the nature of life and the solace found in its imitation. When she spoke, her voice was the sound of silk brushing against silk, a melody without a source, offering strength drawn from the echoes of blood echoes left behind. It was a transaction of profound strangeness. The hunter would return from an orgy of violence, drenched in the visceral residue of their work, and offer this raw metaphysical currency to a being of serene artifice, who would then transmute it into a sharper purpose, a harder edge to the weapon, a deeper well of vitality. This was the cycle of the dream, to be made ready in a place of perfect peace for the sole purpose of returning to perfect chaos. Jayaman, the first hunter, was the dream's sorrowful anchor. He sat in his weathered wheelchair amidst the tools of his former trade, his body a map of old pains and regrets. His breathing was a shallow, rattling thing, the sound of dry leaves skittering across stone. In his rare moments of wakefulness, his eyes, sunken in a face like weathered leather, would hold a flicker of terrible knowledge, a glimpse of the abyss he had peered into for so long. He offered guidance, but it was fragmented, layered with a bitterness that time had not softened. He spoke of Lawrence and his master, Willem, not with nostalgia, but with the weary tone of a man recalling a fatal mistake. His warnings were etched in cynicism. "Oh, Lawrence, what's taking you so long?" he would mutter, his voice a dry rasp, the question hanging in the still air like a curse. He was a prisoner as much as the hunter, bound to this dream as its custodian, his fate intertwined with the moon presence in a way he would never fully articulate. His greatest fear, whispered in the throes of a troubled sleep, was not of the beasts, but of the dream itself, and the lifeless, hideous doll that was his only company. He was a living monument to the price of the hunt, a man who had seen the truth and found it to be a cage. To leave this poignant stillness and step back into the cathedral ward was to experience a kind of metaphysical whiplash. The transition was not a mere change of location, but a shift in the density of reality itself. The ward was the epicenter of the healing church's power, and its decay was therefore all the more ornate, all the more profound. The grand plazas, once meant for solemn processions of faithful clergy, were now arenas of desecration. The white stone of the cathedrals, which should have gleamed in the moonlight, was streaked with dark, weeping stains of old blood and something blacker, a tarry residue that seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly life. The statues of saints and scholars, their features worn smooth by centuries of devotion, were now defaced, their heads smashed or covered in bestial scratches, their outstretched hands now looking less like a blessing and more like a plea for help that never came. The enemies here were different. They were not the feral, desperate creatures of the lower quarters, but the fallen guardians of the faith itself. The church servants, men and women who had once tended the grand gardens and maintained the sacred halls, now shambled through the courtyards, their white robes torn and stained. They wielded their giant staves and crucifixes not with holy purpose, but with a mindless, aggressive fervor, their faces hidden by hoods, their humanity utterly erased by the very doctrines they had served. Their attacks were slow, heavy, and predictable, but they carried the weight of a broken covenant, each blow a physical manifestation of a betrayed ideal. More terrifying were the church doctors, the healers who had become the disease. They lurked in the narrower, shadowed passages, their bodies grotesquely swollen and distorted by their own medical experiments, their once clean surgical garb now fused to their mutated flesh. They moved with a jerky, unnatural speed, their attacks a flurry of poisoned blades and projectiles, a horrifying perversion of their original art of healing. To face them was to understand that the church's fall was not an invasion from without, but a cancer that had metastasized from within its most trusted organs. The very layout of the ward was a labyrinth of devotion and paranoia. It was a district designed to inspire awe and control, with its multiple tiers, its hidden elevators operated by complex mechanisms, and its many locked doors that required specific seals or passwords, the church bow or the chief hunter's emblem. These were not mere security measures. They were theological barriers designed to keep the unworthy from the inner sanctums of power. Navigating them felt like solving a puzzle whose solution was heresy. The hunter, an outsider, was systematically breaking the church's most sacred protocols, moving ever closer to the heart of the mystery. Each unlocked gate a symbolic breach in the crumbling edifice of their authority. One such gate, operated by the chief hunter's emblem, led to a place that felt like a secret within a secret, the abandoned old workshop. Tucked away in a forgotten corner of the Cathedral ward, accessible only by a hidden elevator that descended into a dark, overgrown pocket of the city, it was a place frozen in time. The air here was thick with the dust of decades, a fine, golden motes dancing in the slivers of pale moonlight that pierced the broken roof. This was Jayaman's original workshop, a place that predated the dream. Here, the tools of the first hunters lay exactly as they had been left. A half-finished trick weapon on a workbench, its mechanisms exposed like the guts of a strange metal beast. Vials of old blood, now congealed and dark, sitting on a shelf, notes written in a frantic, fading hand, speaking of a pale moon and a contract. The most poignant presence was another doll, identical to the one in the dream, but here she lay on the floor, broken and lifeless, her porcelain cracked, her elegant dress faded and torn. She was a relic of a tangible past, a proof that the dream was a copy, a memory made manifest. Finding her was like discovering the ghost of a ghost, a reminder that the serene companion in the dream was born from a moment of profound human despair. This workshop was the physical root of the hunter's spectral home, and it whispered the truth that the dream, for all its peace, was built upon a foundation of real, historical loss. Beyond the ward lay old Yharnam, a district that served as a grim premonition of the entire city's fate. If the Cathedral ward was the heart of the current plague, old Yharnam was a scar from an older, more contained outbreak. It was a place that had been sacrificed, burned, and sealed away in a previous hunt, a failed attempt to cauterize the wound. Descending into it was like stepping into a charcoal drawing. The buildings were skeletal, their timbers blackened and twisted by the great fire that had purged the area, their stonework stained a uniform, sooty gray. The air was thick with ash, a fine black snow that settled on the tongue and in the lungs, and the primary smell was not blood, but the acrid, ancient scent of smoke and cooked meat. This was a tomb within a tomb, a place where the healing church had admitted its first great failure and had chosen to simply bury the evidence. But the scourge does not respect burial. The beasts of old Yharnam were different yet again. They were veterans of the fire, their fur singed away in patches, their skin covered in glossy, tough scar tissue. They moved with a desperate, cornered aggression, their forms a testament to a survival that was itself a kind of curse. They were living reminders that the church's solution of purgatorial fire had only created a new, more resilient strain of the disease. And presiding over this charnel district was a figure who represented a schism within the hunt itself. Jura, the retired hunter, perched high on his tower with a mounted Gatling gun, he was a sentinel of regret. His voice, calm and weary, would drift down to the hunter below, not with a threat, but with a plea. "You there, hunter? Didn't you see the warning? Turn back. The beasts of old Yharnam are of no harm to those above. Leave them be, and they will do the same for you." His was a philosophy born from the other side of the violence. He had participated in the burning of old Yharnam and had come to see the beasts not as monsters to be eradicated, but as victims, tragic souls who deserved the peace of their grave. He was the hunter's conscience given a voice and a very large gun, a living challenge to the simplistic morality of the hunt. To engage him was to confront the question of whether one was a protector of humanity or merely a weapon of indiscriminate slaughter. A question that would only grow more complex and more painful as the night deepened. The path from old Yharnam's ashen silence did not lead upward toward cleaner air, but seemed to coil ever deeper, as if the city were a great, dying beast and the hunter a parasite navigating its collapsing viscera. The next threshold was not marked by a grand archway or a cathedral spire, but by a descent into the earth itself, into the healing church's most sacred and most profane space. The cathedral ward's underbelly, a place known in hushed, terrified tones as the healing church workshop. This was not a place of learning or gentle convalescence. It was a vertical engine of devotion and dread, a great, hollowed-out tower whose innards were a latticework of wooden beams, precarious elevators, and spiraling staircases that groaned with the weight of centuries and secrets. The air here was a stark contrast to the open decay above. It was close, still and heavy with the smell of old incense, lamp oil, and the distinct, formaldehyde-like scent of preserving fluids. It was the smell of a place where things were kept, studied, and hidden away from the sun forever. To navigate the workshop was an act of faith in physics itself. The wooden platforms, slick with a perpetual, oily dampness, creaked ominously underfoot. The only illumination came from the occasional, lone lantern casting a small, desperate pool of yellow light, making the shadows between them seem all the more absolute and hungry. The sounds here were intimate and unnerving. The distant, rhythmic drip of water hitting stone from some unseen source, the scuttling of small, many-legged things in the darkness between the walls, and the low, guttural chanting that seemed to emanate from the very stone. This was the sound of the church giants who patrolled these depths, their blindfolded faces turned inward, their massive forms moving with a slow, tectonic patience. They were the silent guardians of the church's deepest truths, and their presence in such a confined space made them seem less like creatures and more like moving pillars of the architecture, part of the very trap the hunter had to navigate. The purpose of this place became horrifyingly clear as one descended. It was a repository for failures. In alcoves cut into the stone walls, one could find the remains of early experiments, skeletons twisted into impossible shapes, their bones fused and elongated, preserved in jars of cloudy fluid. These were not beasts, but something else, something that spoke of a transformation halted mid-process, a glimpse into a biology that was never meant to be. It was a gallery of the church's ambition, each specimen a frozen moment of agony and blasphemous inquiry. The further down one went, the colder the air became, until the breath plumed in the lantern light, and the stone walls were beaded with condensation. This deep chill was not natural. It was the cold of the altar of despair, a place that seemed to leach all warmth and hope from its surroundings. To finally stand before the altar was to feel the full, weeping weight of the cosmos. It was a chamber of pure, polished black stone, situated in a place that felt outside the normal flow of time. The air was so still it felt solid, and the cold was a physical pressure, a numbness that began in the fingertips and spread inward toward the soul. And in the center of this perfect, dark silence was Ebrietta's, daughter of the cosmos. She was not a monster in the way the cleric beast was a monster. She was a tragedy on a galactic scale. Her form was a beautiful, terrible confluence of flesh and constellation, a winged, pale thing whose lower body was a tangle of viscous, translucent tentacles that seemed to be made of solidified light and sorrow. She did not attack with rage, but with a profound, weary grief. Her movements were slow, almost reluctant, her attacks accompanied by a sound that was less a raw and more a heartbroken keen, the cry of a child left behind by its parents. She was the sauce, the literal font from which the church had drawn the old blood, and she was found here not as a conqueror, but as a prisoner, a weeping god chained to the altar of those who worshipped her. To fight her was to commit a profound act of desecration, to slaughter a weeping, abandoned child for the sins of its foolish, greedy adopters. Her death was the quietest of all, a dissolution into a soft, shimmering light that left behind not a corpse, but an emptiness more vast and sorrowful than any physical presence could be. Emerging from this deep, sacred cold was like being born anew into a world of heightened, feverish sensation. The journey now turned outward toward the periphery of the city, to a place where the land itself seemed to be sickening. Hemwick Charnel Lane was a region of moors and bleak, wind-scoured hills, a place where the industrial aspects of death were practiced. This was where the bodies were taken, both human and beast, to be processed, dismembered, and rendered down. The air here was a foul miasma, a thick soup of the smells of a charnel house. The greasy smoke from ever-burning crematorium pyres, the metallic tang of spilled blood soaking into the peat, and the underlying, sweet putrid stench of offal and decaying flesh. The land was barren, dotted with gibbets and gallows from which hung skeletal remains, their bones picked clean by the enormous, malignant crows that were the lane's true rulers. The inhabitants of Hemwick were the grave women, haggard, stooped figures who practiced a cruder, more visceral form of the church's arts. They were the surgeons of the dead, their hands and aprons permanently stained a dark brown, their eyes gleaming with a covetous light from within their hoods. They did not seek communion with the cosmos, they sought its physical remnants. They scavenged the eyes of the dead, both human and otherwise, believing them to be vessels of insight, and they sewed them into their own flesh and into the bodies of the monstrous, dog-like creatures they commanded. Their magic was a bloody, pragmatic thing, a witchcraft of bone and suture, and their leader, the Witch of Hemwick, was a being who had so fully embraced this philosophy that she had become a creature of two bodies, phasing between the visible and the spectral, her true form protected by a horde of crawling, emaciated minions she summoned from the very air. This was a different kind of heresy, not the intellectual hubris of the choir or the ritualistic madness of Mensis, but a peasant's greedy, desperate clawing at the divine, a reminder that the thirst for power infected every level of this dying society. Yet all these paths, through the sacred, the profane, and the industrial, were merely preludes, feeders into the main artery of the city's doom. The Mensis ritual had not been an isolated event. It was an ongoing catastrophe, a wound that continued to bleed into the waking world. The evidence of this was Yahargal, the unseen village. To arrive there, whether by being snatched away or by following the trail of the ritual's aftermath, was to witness the full, horrifying fruit of the school of Mensis's labors. The village was not merely a place, it was a state of being. The air crackled with palpable, malevolent energy, a static that made the hair on one's arms stand on end and filled the mouth with the taste of ozone and old pennies. The sky here was a different color, a deep, bruised purple, and the pale blood moon hung so low and large, it seemed one could reach up and touch its sickly, porous surface. The architecture of Yharnam was the most blatant evidence of the ritual's success. The very stones of the buildings had become alive, or had been replaced by something that mimicked stone. They pulsed with a slow, rhythmic beat and were warm to the touch, like the skin of a feverish giant. The corpses of the Mensis scholars were everywhere, but they were not rotting. They were desiccated, mummified where they sat or stood, their bodies frozen in the final moments of the ritual, their minds and souls catapulted into the nightmare, while their physical forms were left as empty, crumbling shells. They were tended to by the cramped caskets, monstrous, crawling things that were less beasts and more amalgamations of fused, suffering bodies, their countless limbs scrabbling mindlessly at the ground, their purpose as inscrutable as the ritual that created them. And then there were the amygdalae. In the rest of Yharnam, they were invisible to all but the most insightful, clinging to the architecture like spectral parasites. In Yharnam, they were fully, terrifyingly manifest. They were not hiding. They clung to the bell towers and cathedral spires of the village, their many limbs wrapped possessively around the stonework, their weeping, faceless heads turned toward the hunter. They were no longer observers. They were the new landlords of this transformed reality, the custodians of a world where the ritual had successfully fused the waking world with the outer spheres. Their presence was a constant, oppressive weight, a reminder that the door Mensis had opened could not be closed, and that the things on the other side had now taken up permanent residence. The heart of this nightmare was the Yharnam Chapel, a place that defied all sane geometry. To fight one's way to its summit was to battle through a landscape of solidified madness, against enemies that were resurrected by the tolling of an unseen, spectral bell, their bodies reforming from pools of shimmering light. The final guardian of this profane heart was the one reborn, a being that was the ritual's ultimate product and testament. It was not born, but assembled. A grotesque, twitching mountain of corpse spots, 100 limbs spasming without coordination, a dozen mouths screaming in dissonant agony. It was a perverse mockery of life, a golem stitched together from the physical remains of the ritual's victims, and animated by the chaotic, screaming energy of the torn cosmos. It had no mind, no soul, only a terrible, collective pain and a directive to destroy. To defeat, it was not to slay a beast, but to dismantle a failed experiment, to put a stop to the agonized writhing of a thing that should never have been. Its death was a relief, a cacophonous collapse into a pile of inert, rotting meat, the end of a scream that had gone on for far too long. But this victory was meaningless. The destruction of the one reborn did not halt the ritual. It was merely the clearing of an obstacle. The ritual was not a single event that could be stopped. It was a new, permanent state of affairs. The true goal, the hunter was beginning to understand lay not in the broken, pulsating reality of Yahargal, but in the dimension it was connected to. The Mensis nightmare was the psychic echo of that catastrophic ceremony, a realm where the minds of the scholars were trapped, forever reenacting their ambition and their folly. To reach it required a key, and that key was the tonsil stone, given by a strange, friendly man in a window, a stone that felt like a piece of petrified brain matter, warm and throbbing with a vile intelligence. It was a ticket to a deeper layer of hell. The journey to the nightmare frontier was a descent into a new kind of geography. This was not a place built by hands, but a landscape sculpted from pure, concentrated dread. The ground was a spongy, organic material, like peat, but with the give of rotten fruit, and it released a foul, gaseous sigh with every footstep. The sky was a swirling vortex of dark, bruised colors, shot through with flashes of silent lightning. The very air was a poison, a yellow, gaseous mist that corroded not the body, but the spirit, leaching away vitality with a slow, insidious patience. The terrain was a chaotic jumble of rock formations that looked like melted wax and giant, fossilized bones of creatures that could never have lived in any sane world. This was the antechamber to the Mensis nightmare, a place where the laws of physics had been entirely suspended, replaced by the logic of a fever dream. Here, the hunter was no longer the top of the food chain. The creatures of the frontier were things of pure concept given monstrous form. The silver beasts, with their pulsating, parasitic worms, were walking embodiments of infestation. The giant, floating, jellyfish-like creatures, with their trailing, luminous tentacles, were beings of pure, melancholic beauty and deadly poison. Their slow, drifting movements a stark contrast to the frantic horror of the landscape. And everywhere, the hunter was hunted by the nightmare apostles, spindly, multi-limbed creatures that dropped from the swirling, sickly sky, their movements a jerky, predatory mockery of life. This was a world that was actively hostile to existence itself, a place that seemed to want to unmake any who entered it, to dissolve them back into the raw, screaming stuff of the nightmare. The path through this toxic, shifting hell was a test of endurance and will, a navigation of a land that seemed to rearrange itself to confound and trap the intruder. It led, inevitably, to a great, stone mausoleum that stood alone in the wastes, a building that looked like a skull half buried in the toxic earth. This was the entrance to the nightmare of Mensis, the inner sanctum, the place where the scholars had achieved their communion and been destroyed by it. To cross its threshold was to leave the antechamber of madness and step directly into its blazing, white-hot core. The air beyond the door changed instantly, becoming dry and cold, filled with a fine mental dust that tasted of old books and despair. The only sound was a constant, low, humming note, the sound of a mind pushed to its absolute breaking point and held there forever. This was where the answers lay, and the final, most terrible leg of the hunt was about to begin, not in the streets of a dying city, but in the haunted, psychic castle of the men who had killed it. The silence within the mausoleum was not an absence of sound, but a presence, a dense, humming pressure that filled the ears and seemed to vibrate in the teeth. It was the sound of concentrated thought, of 100 brilliant minds screaming in unison, their voices blended into a single, monotonous tone of eternal, static anguish. The air was frigid, carrying the dry, alkaline taste of ancient stone and the peculiar, sweetish odor of mummified flesh. Light came from no visible source, but seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a pale, bone-white luminescence that cast no shadows, flattening the world into a stark relief of edges and planes. This was the heart of the nightmare, a fortress built not of brick and mortar, but of dogma and despair, a monument to the moment the human intellect had tried to grasp the infinite and had been petrified in the act. The first chamber was a vast, hollow space, a grand hall whose ceiling was lost in a haze of that same sauceless light. The floor was a mosaic of a complex, spiraling symbol, its tiles cracked and disrupted by great, dark stains that could have been oil or blood or something else entirely. Along the walls, seated in high, throne-like chairs, were the scholars of Mensis. They were not skeletons, but desiccated husks, their skin drawn tight over their skulls, their mouths frozen open in a final, silent invocation or a scream. They still wore the tattered remnants of their academic robes, and in their laps or clutched in their bony fingers were open books, their pages blank, the knowledge they had sought having evaporated in the instant of contact, leaving only the hollow vessel of its pursuit. They were a council of the dead, presiding over a kingdom of absolute, sterile knowledge, a knowledge that had killed them the moment it was attained. Moving through this hall of frozen sages was a profoundly lonely experience. The only sound was the hunter's own footsteps, which seemed both too loud and yet swallowed instantly by the immense, waiting silence. The path ahead was a series of narrow, winding staircases and bridged chasms, the architecture a maddening, non-Euclidean puzzle. Staircases doubled back on themselves, leading to balconies that overlooked the very space one had just left from a different, impossible angle. Doorways opened into rooms that were geometrically incongruous, their dimensions subtly wrong, causing a low-grade vertigo that was as much spiritual as physical. This was a mind palace, but the mind that had built it was shattered, and its architecture reflected that broken state, a labyrinth with a madman at its center who was no longer there. The primary inhabitants of this mental fortress were not beasts, but the lingering, automated defenses of a lost consciousness. The shadows of Yharnam were here, not as the solitary, cowled figures found in the waking world, but in greater numbers, their forms flitting through the stark light like living ink stains. They were the manifest will of the nightmare, the enforcers of its sterile, paranoid order. They moved with a chilling synchronicity, their attacks a coordinated dance of flaming blades and arcane serpents that erupted from the very ground, their purpose to expunge the living, breathing anomaly that was the hunter from this realm of dead thought. Fighting them here in this place of echoes felt less like a battle and more like an argument with a ghost, a struggle against a memory that had been programmed to reject anything new. Beyond the first great hall, the nightmare opened into a vast, cavernous space that defied all sense of interior and exterior. It was a rocky chasm, spanned by a precarious wooden bridge, and above, a false, starless sky swirled with chaotic, bruised colors. The air here hummed with a different energy, a frenetic, aggressive madness. This was the domain of the spiders, but not the simple, earthly arachnids of the waking world. These were the nightmare apostles, creatures of a size and intelligence that were the stuff of fever dreams. They were not merely animals, they were weavers, architects of this particular strand of terror. Their bodies were bloated and hairy, their countless eyes gleaming with a malicious, collective awareness. Some scuttled across the rock faces with horrifying speed, while others hung from the ceiling, suspended on cables of silk as thick as rope, their mandibles clicking in a language of pure hunger. And among them moved the more humanoid, spindly forms, the ones who seemed to direct the swarm, their long, pale limbs moving with a ghastly, deliberate grace. This was an ecosystem of predation, a food chain of fear established within the nightmare, and the hunter was the intruder threatening to disrupt its delicate, horrific balance. Navigating this web-choked chasm was a lesson in controlled panic. The groan of the wooden bridge underfoot was a constant reminder of the precariousness of existence here. The skittering of countless legs on stone was a sound that came from everywhere at once, a surround sound of impending violation. The most terrifying moments were not the direct confrontations, but the pauses, the instances of silence broken only by the drip of some viscous fluid, where the hunter would wait, tensed, for the next ambush to descend from the swirling, formless sky above. It was a place designed to erode courage and fray the nerves, to make one feel like an insect being studied by a vast, uncaring intelligence. The culmination of this leg of the journey was a vast, circular arena, a place that felt like a coliseum built for a single, terrible performance. The air here was still and heavy, charged with a palpable sense of anticipation. And at its center, waiting, was the master of this particular domain, the keeper of the frenzied flame that burned at the nightmare's core, Mikolash, host of the nightmare. He was not a beast, nor a warrior, but a man, or the ghost of one. He was a pitiable, frantic figure, dressed in the tattered remains of Mensis robes, a metal cage encasing his head, as if to contain the thoughts that had already escaped and destroyed him. He did not stand and fight. He fled, his laughter a high, manic sound that echoed through the stone halls, a laughter that was indistinguishable from sobbing. The chase through the library of his mind was a surreal and frustrating pursuit. He would phase through mirrors and barred gates, always staying just out of reach, his voice taunting and lecturing from the darkness. Ah, Kos, or some say Cosm, do you hear our prayers? He would cry out, his words a jumble of cosmic yearning and fractured sanity. He was not truly a threat in the physical sense. He was the embodiment of the ritual's failure, a man who had reached for the cosmos and had his mind scoured clean, leaving only the broken record of his obsession. His arena was a hall of mirrors and shifting bookcases, a physical representation of a mind running in circles, trapped in a single, unanswerable question. To finally corner him was to witness not a monster, but the final, shuddering death of curiosity, a thing that had once been human now reduced to a vessel for a single, screaming idea. His defeat was abrupt and strangely hollow. As he fell, his last words were not a curse, but a plea, a final, desperate fragment of the question that had consumed him. The cage on his head cracked, and the frantic light in his eyes went out, leaving only the empty shell. But his death did not bring silence. Instead, it seemed to deepen the humming in the air to focus it. The nightmare had lost its host, but the parasite remained. The way forward was now clear, leading to a vast, open balcony overlooking an infinite black sea. And waiting there, draped over the stone balustrade like a forgotten shroud, was the true source of the Mensis nightmare's power, the great one they had managed to beckon, the one who now used their ritual as a lens to project its influence. Murgo's wet nurse. This was a being of an entirely different order. It did not move, it flowed, its form a confluence of shadow and silken, purple fabric, its multiple, slender arms each holding a wickedly curved blade that seemed to drink the light from the air. It had no face, only a void from which whispered the lullabies of dead children. It was a protector, a guardian of the source of the nightmare's central, weeping sorrow. Its fight was a silent, deadly ballet, a whirlwind of blades and teleporting darkness, a performance of such alien grace and lethality that it felt less like a battle and more like witnessing a natural disaster, a hurricane given sentience and purpose. The air grew cold with its presence, and the only sounds were the whisper-soft rustle of its garments, the sharp ring of blade on blade, and the haunting, ethereal music box melody that seemed to emanate from its very core. To defeat the wet nurse was to perform the ultimate act of mercy-killing. Its dissolution was not an explosion, but an unraveling, the silken shadows that composed its form drifting apart like smoke, the whispering lullaby fading into a final, sighing silence. And with its passing, the source of the noise was revealed. In an ornate, black pram in the center of the balcony was the object of all this cosmic yearning, the heart of the Mensis nightmare, the infant great one, Murgo. But it was not a child of flesh and blood. It was a presence, a wailing, formless consciousness, its cries the very engine of the nightmare. And as the wet nurse faded, the cries began to soften, to weaken, until they ceased altogether. The silence that followed was the most profound sound the hunter had ever heard. It was the sound of an ending, of a cosmic grief finally, mercifully, being put to rest. A chime echoed through the dissolving nightmare, a soft, clear note that was the antithesis of the maddening hum. The world of Mensis began to waver, its stone becoming translucent, its stark light dimming. The job was done. The nightmare was slain. The hunter was being beckoned back, their contract nearing its end. But as the world faded, a final, crucial choice presented itself. The dream awaited, and with it, the old man in the wheelchair, ready to offer the promised release, to sever the tie that bound the hunter to the dream and the hunt, to grant a waking dawn in a world that was still shrouded in eternal night. But another path glimmered, a secret held in the blood of a great one found in the ruins of the past, a path that spoke not of release, but of ascension, of facing the author of the dream itself. The hunter stood at the precipice, not of a balcony overlooking a sea of darkness, but of a decision that would define not just their own fate, but the very nature of the story they had been living. The dream and its master waited. The return to the hunter's dream was different this time. The transition was not a jarring snap from chaos to calm, but a slow, viscous seepage, as if the nightmare's residue was reluctant to release its hold. The familiar scent of grave blossoms and damp stone met the hunter, but it was underscored now by a new, faint odor, the ozone-tinged aftertaste of slain gods and silenced lullabies. The doll was waiting as ever, her porcelain face tilted in its expression of serene attentiveness. But her eyes, for the first time, seemed to hold a glimmer of something beyond programmed compassion. A spark of knowing, a silent acknowledgement of the profound shift that had occurred in the metaphysical scales. "Welcome home, good hunter," she said, her voice the same soft melody, yet it now seemed to carry the echo of Murgo's final, fading cry. "The night is near its end. Jayaman awaits you beneath the tree." And there he was, the first hunter, a silhouette of weary anguish against the soft glow of the lumen flowers. He was not asleep in his chair, but standing, leaning heavily on his burial blade, its curved metal catching the dream's impossible moonlight. His breathing was a ragged, painful sound in the stillness. "The night and the dreamer were long," he rasped, his voice grinding like millstones. He did not look at the hunter, but up at the featureless, placid sky of the dream, a sky that was a lie, a painted ceiling hiding the true, bloody cosmos beyond. "You've done well, hunter. The nightmare is slain, the source of the scourge is severed." A long, shuddering sigh escaped him. "You freed me from these terrible dreams, and now I will free you." His offer was simple, a ritual of release as old as the dream itself. He would wield his scythe not as a weapon, but as a key. One swift, merciful strike, and the contract would be broken. The hunter would awaken, as from a long and fevered sleep, in the waking world of Yharnam, just as the new sun, a real sun, began to crest the horizon. The memory of the hunt would remain, a half-remembered phantom of a terrible night, but the dream, the doll, the endless cycle would be gone. It was a promise of peace, of normalcy, a return to a life unburdened by the weight of cosmic truths and blood-soaked epiphanies. It was the easiest choice, the final, gentle lie after a night of brutal honesty. But the hunter had consumed too much, seen too deeply. The blood of slain great ones coursed not just through their veins, but through their understanding. They had stood in the presence of weeping celestial daughters and fought shadows that guarded infant gods. They had felt the gaze of the moon presence upon them, a cold, possessive pressure that had been a constant, unseen companion throughout the hunt. To accept Jaemin's mercy was to reject that knowledge, to willingly blind oneself once more. It was to become like the citizens of Yharnam, huddled behind their barricades, choosing the comfort of ignorance over the terrifying clarity of the truth. And the hunter was no longer that person. There was another path, one whispered in the echoes of the old blood, a path that required not submission, but defiance. Scattered throughout the night were 3/1/3 of an umbilical cord, pale, writhing fragments of immense power, the physical remnants of a great one's lost child. To consume them was not merely to gain insight, it was to ingest a lineage, to incorporate the very substance of a cosmic lineage into one's own being. It was to become a candidate, a viable surrogate for the attention of the great ones. The hunter, having consumed these cords, felt a new awareness unfolding within, a third eye opening in the mind, seeing the strings that pulled the puppets of this reality. They could see the true nature of the dream now, not as a refuge, but as a snare, a beautiful, gilded cage constructed by the moon presence to cultivate a perfect, obedient hunter, a surrogate for the child it could never have. To choose this path was to refuse Jaemin's offer, and his response was not one of disappointment, but of a profound, weary sorrow. "Dear, oh dear," he murmured, his head bowing. What was it? The hunt, the blood, or the horrible dream? It doesn't matter. It always comes down to the hunter's helper to clean up after these sorts of messes. His sorrow transformed then into something else, a cold, professional resolve. The air in the dream grew sharp, the gentle breeze stilling as if holding its breath. The lumen flowers seemed to wilt in their beds. Jaemin rose to his full height, his frailty falling away like a discarded cloak. In that moment, he was no longer the old man in the wheelchair. He was the first hunter, the master of the workshop, the living weapon who had defined the art of the hunt. The battle that ensued was not like the chaotic, roaring struggles against beasts or the mind-bending wars with cosmic entities. It was a duel, intimate and heartbreakingly beautiful. It was a dance between a master and his finest and final student. Jaemin moved with a ghostly, impossible grace, his scythe, the burial blade, an extension of his will, whistling through the still air of the dream. He did not fight with rage, but with a deep, ingrained melancholy each sweep of the blade, a verse in a eulogy for the hunter he was now forced to destroy. He phased in and out of visibility, becoming a swirl of tattered coat and gleaming metal. His attacks a fluid sequence of cuts and thrusts that seemed to draw the very light from the dream into their arc. The sound was not the brutal crunch of beast flesh, but the clean, singing note of honed steel cutting space itself. To fight him was to engage with the very history of the hunt. His movements were the foundation upon which every hunter's technique was built. He was the origin of the quick step, the parry, the visceral attack. He was a living library of slaughter, and to oppose him was to read that library, one deadly page at a time. The doll watched, unmoving, her hands clasped, her painted eyes reflecting the clash of wills. There was no encouragement, no plea, only a silent, terrible witness to this final, necessary conflict between the creator and his creation. The warden and the prisoner seeking to shatter the walls of the prison itself. When the final blow was struck, it was not a moment of triumph, but of immense, soul-crushing pathos. Jayaman did not dissolve into shining motes or collapse into a monstrous form. He simply fell, his strength spent, his long vigil finally over. He lay on the grey cobbles, his body looking small and shrunken once more, the great scythe clattering beside him. His last words were a whisper, carried away on a sudden, gentle gust of wind that smelled of fresh flowers. Dear, oh dear, what a mess you've been caught up in, and tonight, of all nights. He then spoke a name that was a key to a past forever lost. Lawrence, Master Willem, somebody, help me, I'm so cold. His voice faded, and the first hunter was gone, his dream finally ended. The silence that followed was deeper than any the hunter had ever known, a silence that was both a release and a condemnation. And then the dream began to change. The placid, false sky above rippled like the surface of a disturbed pond, then tore open like parchment. Through the rent descended the author of the dream, the silent partner in the contract, the source of the pale moon's light. The moon presence. It was a vision of terrifying elegance, a being of stark, biological minimalism. Its form was pale and skeletal, a framework of bone and sinew that seemed to articulate a concept rather than a creature. It had long, slender limbs that ended in wickedly sharp claws, and a skeletal head that was little more than an elongated jaw, from which hung a single, dripping, visceral organ. It did not roar or scream. Its arrival was utterly silent, a vacuum of sound that was more deafening than any noise. It was the embodiment of the hunt, the source of the compulsion, the pale moon given a singular, yearning will. It had lost a child, and in its grief, it had crafted this endless, cyclical dream to find a surrogate, a stand-in for its loss. Jayaman had been its first and most loyal servant, but the hunter, brimming with the power of 3 umbilical cords, was a new possibility, a being of sufficient strength and insight to not just serve, but to replace. Its attack was not a physical assault in the conventional sense. It was an unraveling. The very air of the dream became a weapon, a pale, crimson light emanating from the moon presence that sapped vitality, that reversed the flow of blood healing, that sought to unmake the hunter on a fundamental level. It moved with a floating, weightless menace, its claws slashing at the space around the hunter, each strike carrying the chill of the void between stars. To fight, it was to fight a force of nature, a gravitational pull towards oblivion. The doll remained, a still point in the chaos, her form now seeming less like a comfort and more like a monument to the loneliness that had driven this cosmic being to such desperate ends. This was the final test, the true baptism. The hunter was no longer fighting for Yharnam or for release, or even for their own life. They were fighting for the right to define their own existence, to break free from the role of a pawn and become a player on the board. The power of the umbilical cords surged within, a defiant fire against the moon presence's chilling light. This was not a battle of hunter and beast, but of two conflicting aspirations. One, to possess a child, and the other, to be free of all possession. Victory against such a being was not marked by a death cry, but by a silent, spectacular dissolution. The moon presence did not die. It unraveled, its pale form bursting into a torrent of shimmering, white blood that fell like a gentle, cosmic rain upon the dream. And as its essence soaked into the ground, the hunter, overcome by the immense power and the culmination of their journey, felt their own form dissolving, not into nothingness, but into something new. Their human shape could no longer contain the insight they had accumulated, the power of the old blood they had mastered, the lineage of the great ones they had ingested. The world swam, the dream melting and reforming around them. They felt their consciousness expanding, stretching beyond the confines of a single body, becoming vast, diffuse. They were aware of the doll approaching, her movements now filled with a new, profound purpose. She knelt, and with an infinite tenderness, she cradled the nascent form the hunter was becoming. A small, pale, squirming being, a larval thing of immense potential. This was not a death, it was a metamorphosis. The hunter had transcended the hunt, the dream, and the waking world. They had become an infant great one, a new celestial child in a cosmos of grieving parents. The final sight was from this new, elevated perspective. The hunter's dream, now freed from the moon presence's influence, began to wither. The workshop decayed in fast-forward, wood splintering, stone crumbling. The lumen flowers shriveled and turned to dust. The doll remained, a solitary, loving figure in the ruins, holding the newborn great one, the new master of a new dream, a silent, watching moon to some future, unknown night. The hunt was over. The nightmare was past. A new story, vast, silent, and utterly incomprehensible to the world left behind, had just begun its first, soft, whimpering breath. The silence that followed was not empty, but full. It was the silence of a watchful God, a consciousness so vast and so new that it had not yet learned to form thoughts in any language that could be spoken or written. The world, as seen from this elevated plane, was a tapestry of interlocking dreams and realities, each thread a life, a memory, a nightmare. Yharnam was a dark, bruised knot in that tapestry, its suffering a localized fever that was already beginning to cool, the violent heat of the hunt giving way to the slow, creeping chill of desolation, and eventually forgetfulness. The hunter, now the infant great one, perceived this not with eyes, but with a sense that was purer than sight, a faculty of direct knowing that absorbed the essence of things without the need for crude interpretation. The doll, their first and only worshipper, was a point of exquisite focus in this new sensory field. Her love was not a human emotion. It was a programmed devotion, a perfect, unwavering constant in the swirling chaos of nascent cosmic awareness. Her porcelain hands were cool against the hunter's new, soft form, a sensation that anchored the boundless self to a single, tender point of contact. She was the nursery, the temple, and the sole parishioner of this new, quiet faith. In the waking world, the change was subtle at first, perceptible only to those with the faintest dregs of insight still clinging to their shattered minds. The oppressive weight of the pale blood moon simply lifted. It did not vanish, but its light lost its sickly, transformative quality, reverting to the cold, sterile silver of a normal moon, distant and indifferent once more. The constant, psychic hum that had frayed the edges of reality faded into a true silence, leaving behind an emptiness that was, for the first time in a long time, natural. The amygdalae clinging to the cathedrals did not disappear, but they became still, their weeping ceasing, their many limbs retracting as they entered a state of deep, stone-like hibernation, returning to their roles as unseen observers. The connection had been severed, the door to the nightmare was closed, and the things on the other side had lost their interest. The beasts, bereft of the moon's maddening influence, did not revert to humanity. Such a thing was impossible. The transformation was a one-way road paved with rewritten biology. But the frantic, intelligent aggression bled out of them. The organized packs dissolved. The cunning ambushes ceased. They became what they had perhaps always been meant to be. Animals, dangerous and feral, but driven by simple hunger and instinct, not by a cosmic compulsion or a remembered shred of human spite. The hunt, as an institution, was over. There were no more church bells signaling the start of the cull, no more white-clad hunters moving with grim purpose through the streets. The few hunters who remained, those not lost to beasthood or their own despair, simply found themselves one morning without a purpose. The compulsion was gone. Some lowered their weapons, the weight of them suddenly unbearable, and simply walked away from Yharnam, never to return. Others, too far gone, could not relinquish the only life they remembered and became beasts in truth, or hollowed-out madmen patrolling empty streets, fighting enemies that were no longer there. The city itself began the long, slow process of dying in earnest. Without the hunt to constantly churn the streets with fresh violence, a profound stillness settled over the districts. The barricaded doors remained barricaded, but the whispers from behind them slowly ceased, one by one, as starvation, despair, or the final, merciful release of sleep claimed those who had hidden for so long. The grand cathedrals of the healing church stood empty, their vast naves inhabited only by dust motes dancing in the slivers of light that pierced the stained glass windows, the scenes of divine communion now looking like cruel parodies. The coppery scent of blood was slowly overlaid by the older, more fundamental smells of damp stone, dry rot, and the sweet, cloying odor of unchecked decay. Yharnam was becoming a fossil, a city-sized carcass being cleaned by the slow, patient scavengers of time. In the ruins of the hunter's dream, the only movement was the doll, tending to her charge. The landscape was static now, a diorama of a forgotten promise. The workshop was a skeleton of itself, its tools rusted into uselessness, the whetstone wheel frozen solid. The little messenger creatures, bereft of their purpose, had curled up in the flower beds and turned to stone, their tiny, withered forms becoming part of the garden's grim decoration. Yet, the doll's devotion was unshaken. She would hum a soft, wordless melody, a lullaby without a sauce, as she cradled the infant Great One. This new being, this successor to the moon presence, did not yearn or grieve. Its consciousness was a placid lake, deep and unknowable. It was simply being, its existence a quiet counterpoint to the frantic striving that had characterized its predecessor and the city it had watched over. It was learning the geometry of its new realm, feeling the echoes of the old dreams that had been dreamt here, and slowly, patiently, beginning to weave its own. This new dream was not one of compulsion or hunting. It was a dream of observation, of quiet witness. It would be a place for lost things, for memories that had no home in the waking world, for echoes of stories that had ended too soon. It would be a gentler place, a sanctuary not for warriors, but for ghosts. And the hunter at its center would be its silent, watching heart. They had sought to escape the dream, and in doing so had become its eternal master. They had wanted to cure their own minuscule ailment, and had instead swallowed the cosmos and been remade by it. The pursuit of pale blood had led not to a simple transfusion, but to a transfiguration, a shedding of the mortal coil so complete that it became the genesis of something entirely other. The final threads of the old story were tied off. The tale of Biogenwith's ambition, the healing church's fervor, Mensis's folly, and the endless, bloody hunt, it was all over. The pages of that chronicle were closed, the book placed upon a high shelf to gather dust. The silence that descended upon Yharnam was the silence of an ended song, the last, lingering note of a requiem that had been playing for 100 years. The rain that had begun this remembrance finally ceased, its purpose served. The city of blood and nightmares was now a part of history, a cautionary myth whispered in the wind that sighed through its broken spires. And high above, in a realm beyond the reach of any sun or moon, a new dream was beginning, soft as a whisper and deep as the sea, cradled in the arms of a doll who would love it for all eternity.